All right, today we are tackling one of the biggest questions in personal finance. How in the world do you make your retirement savings last for your entire lifetime? We're going to break down a really famous guideline designed to do just that. It's called the 4% rule.
So think about it. You've spent decades working, saving, investing. You finally hit your goal, that magic number. But now comes the really hard part. How do you turn that big pile of savings into a steady income stream that you won't outlive? How much is actually safe to take out each year? This is, without a doubt, the central challenge every single retiree faces.
And the reason this is so darn tricky is because the future is just, well, it's a giant question mark. Is the stock market going to soar, or is it going to slump right when you need the money most? Is inflation going to slowly eat away at your buying power? Are you going to suddenly need a new roof or face some unexpected medical bills? And of course, the biggest variable of all, how long do you actually need this money to last? Any good strategy has to have a plan for all these uncertainties.
So, to navigate all these unknowns, financial planners came up with a guiding principle. It's a concept that's really designed to plan for some of the worst-case scenarios and give you a reliable place to start. It's called the Safe Withdrawal Rate.
So, what is it exactly? Well, the Safe Withdrawal Rate, or SWR for short, is basically a method to figure out how much you can spend from your savings each year without running the well dry. The whole goal is to strike a balance, right? Letting you live comfortably while also making sure your nest egg is there for the long haul.
And when people talk about the SWR, I promise you there is one number you are going to hear way more than any other: 4%. This has become the most common, the most famous rule of thumb in retirement planning. Now, notice the key word here, guideline. This is not a guarantee carved in stone. The basic idea is pretty simple. You withdraw 4% of your portfolio in your very first year of retirement, then you adjust that dollar amount for inflation every year after that. The hope is that this gives your money a really, really high chance of lasting for at least 30 years.
Okay, that all sounds great in theory, but how does it actually work with real numbers? Let's break down the actual math.
The math is actually pretty straightforward. First, you've got to figure out the annual income you'll need to pull from your portfolio. Then you just divide that number by your total retirement savings. And voila, the result is your personal withdrawal rate. Okay, let's put some real numbers to this to see how it plays out. Imagine you've managed to save $800,000 for retirement. We'll use this as our starting point to see how different spending habits can totally change that withdrawal rate. You can see the trade-offs so clearly here. If you only need to pull out $25,000 a year, your rate is a super safe 3.1%. But if you need $35,000, that rate jumps to 4.3%, which puts you just a little over that classic guideline. And what if you need $45,000 a year? Well, now you're at 5.6%, a rate that most financial models would say is starting to get pretty risky.
So that leads to a really crucial question. Let's say you've done your budget, you know your numbers, and you need $45,000 a year to live the retirement you've always dreamed of. How can you use this 4% rule to figure out your total savings goal?
Well, we can just flip the formula right around. You start with the annual income you want, in this case, 45 grand. Then you divide that by your target rate, which is 4%, or 0.04 if you're using a calculator. And there's your answer. To generate $45,000 a year while staying inside that 4% guideline, you need a nest egg of $1,125,000. This is why understanding your withdrawal rate isn't just for retirees. It's an absolutely critical tool for setting your savings goal long before you ever stop working. And trust me, this is a very big but. The 4% rule is not some unbreakable law of finance. It was based on historical data and a very specific set of assumptions, and it's so important to understand where it might bend or maybe even break in the real world.
See, this whole rule comes from research done back in the 1990s, famously the Trinity study, which looked at historical market data. But those assumptions are being challenged today. The study assumed a 30-year retirement, but what if you retire early at 55 and you live to be 95? That's a 40-year horizon. It also relied on historical returns that a lot of economists today think will be lower in the future. Your personal mix of investments and the actual returns you get could totally change the outcome.
And here's the other side of that coin. While a high withdrawal rate is definitely risky, being too conservative has its own cost. If you pick a rate that's unnecessarily low, say 3%, you might end up pinching pennies for decades when you actually could have afforded a more comfortable lifestyle. It really is a balancing act. So, because of all these limitations, some financial planners now prefer a much more flexible approach. Instead of just setting one fixed percentage and sticking to it no matter what, they recommend a more dynamic, adaptable strategy. Let's just compare these two philosophies. The classic, fixed method, that gives you predictability, but it completely ignores what the market is doing in real time. The dynamic approach is all about being adaptable. This could mean using guardrails, like if your portfolio drops by 20%, you cut back your withdrawal by 10%. Or it can mean you recalculate your 4% based on your current portfolio value each year, not the one you started with. The trade-off is you have less income stability from year to year, but you get a potentially much higher chance of long-term success, especially if you retire into a bad market. So, after all that, what should you really take away from this? Where does this leave you when it comes to your own retirement planning? Okay, let's recap the essentials. First, treat the 4% rule as a valuable starting point, but not an unbreakable law. Your personal rate is going to depend on your own goals and your timeline, but always remember, a lower rate offers a much bigger safety margin. And in today's world, a dynamic, flexible strategy might serve you way better than a rigid one. More than anything, just use this concept as a powerful tool to calculate and plan for the financial future that you want. In the end, planning your withdrawals, it's really about writing the first chapter of a story that could last for 30, 40, maybe even 50 years. The safe withdrawal rate isn't the whole plot, but it's an excellent way to make sure that your story has a happy ending. So, what will your first chapter be?